This is the Mile High Fi podcast with Carl Jensen and Doug Cunnington. We have authentic conversations about the journey to Fi, health, happiness, and some very odd tangents. We interview Fi experts, side hustlers, people on their way to Fi, and those who have reached the other side. Join us every week, and if you want the show notes and links and all that other stuff, head over to milehighfi.com.
Hello, world. Welcome to the Mile High Fi podcast. I'm Carl Jensen with my co-host.
I'm Doug Cunnington.
And we have a very special returning guest to tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm J.L. Collins, and I'm author of The Simple Path to Wealth, How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, and my latest book that's newly out, Pathfinders.
Before we get into our conversation, we had a conversation, you and I, JL, a couple of weeks ago, and you told us about the number of books The Simple Path to Wealth has sold. And I hate to focus on this, but I think it's pretty incredible. Can you tell us what that number is?
Yeah, we're closing in on 700,000. That's all formats. So that's print, ebook, Audible, all around the world. So that includes the international sales, but the bulk of it is U.S. But yeah, it's nobody's more amazed than I am.
And how many languages has it been translated into?
Oh, you're testing my memory here. You know, I want to say that it's actually been published in 12, 15, somewhere in that range. And then I have deals for about 20 or 22 altogether. So whenever you sign one of these deals, they have a window. The publisher that signs the deal has a window somewhere between 12 and 18, maybe 24 months usually, that they have in which to get the book published. So it can be a year, even pushing on 2 years before it actually comes out in the language. So that's why there's the gap between the two.
And did you have any, well, if I remember right, the last time we talked, maybe you had 300 or 350K copies sold, which it's been a couple of years. So what do you think the main driver is for sort of the acceleration of more sales at this point? Because it was published in 2017?
2016. Yeah, so it's really kind of grown ever since it was published. It peaked during COVID, and then the last couple of years, 2022 and 2023, they were almost identical, but lower than the COVID high. So when 2022 was less than 2021, I was thinking, oh well, is it just going to sort of drift away into oblivion? It appears not. It appears just that 2021 was that unusual spike, and we're kind of getting back to normal, but normal is a pretty good level.
That's crazy. What is the second biggest country? Well, I'll back up a second. I have to imagine America is the number one for sales. Do you have any idea what number 2 and number 3 are? So
Canada and the UK and the EU in general are probably, 2, 3, and 4, but I'm not quite sure what order they're in. I would guess, Canada or UK are probably neck and neck. And
okay,
yeah.
Cool. So today we're going to talk about some fire talking points that I'm interested to hear JL's take on. We're going to talk a little bit about books and maybe a little bit about asparagus at the end. I'll bet you didn't see the third one coming, did you, JL?
Yeah, that's the one I'm looking forward to. Let's eat dessert first.
So in 1930, John Maynard Keynes once said that everyone would work 15 hours per week by 2030. Instead, we blew up our lifestyles. And I'm wondering, JL, do you think fire is a reaction to this inflation of our lifestyles? In other words, maybe fire folks are just living the Keynes dream where we're making 2030 money, but we're living like it's 1970. So we're just taking advantage of the delta, and we haven't allowed our lifestyles to be blown up. So, yeah, discuss. Was Keynes right?
Well, I remember when I was a kid, hearing that the amount of time that we worked would be a fraction that was one of the predictions a lot of futurists made. And certainly things evolved in a fashion where that should have been, is in fact possible. But as humans, we chose not to do that. We chose instead to inflate our lifestyles and go from families where one person was working to where there frequently both are. And I think that's kind of the human drive in nature into always wanting more. And there's an irony in that, I think, because that drive to always want more tends to make us as individuals a little bit miserable. Because when you never have enough, and no matter what you accomplish, you rapidly become used to it, and you're looking towards the next thing. That's not a happy existence. That's bad news. Collectively, it's a great thing for humanity in general that humans have this drive. It's the reason that as we sit here today, things in the world have never been better. Humans have never been healthier. Poverty levels have never been lower. People have never been wealthier. On all tangible fronts, things have never been better. And yet there is kind of this discontent. And I suspect that comes from that individual, situation of always striving. So to your question, is that driving the FI community? Yeah, maybe it's possible. There's a lot of conversation in the community these days about what's enough look like, right? And I think those, for personal satisfaction, those are important conversations to have. And FI allows us to arrange our affairs so that we can build wealth that can support us, and we can make those kinds of decisions. We can decide, okay, I've got enough. I don't have to stay on the treadmill.
It's startling to see the changes that have happened even in my life. I'm not that old, but when I was a kid, the house we lived in, I think my parents bought it new. So this was what a new house looked like back then. I think it was about 800 finished square feet. It was 3 beds. I remember the 2 smaller bedrooms were 10 by 10, which I think by code might have been the minimum, although I'm not sure on that. But it had 1 bathroom, and we had 4 people living in there. And now today, we live in a house with 4 bedrooms, and we have 4 toilets. So everyone has their own toilet, whereas when I grew up, we had 1. It's pretty startling to see the inflation that has happened just in our lives. And I think of like air travel. I was on a plane once before I was 18, and I think now I probably go 10 times a year on planes, which is pretty crazy. It's amazing how much better our lives have gotten in such a short amount of time. But the caveat to that is, Jael, I'd be curious to hear your thought on this, and Doug's too, is I don't remember being unhappy as a kid either. Like maybe I had to wait to use the toilet every once in a while, but that was it. Life was fine back then too. I don't think I'm that much happier because I have a larger home.
It was the same thing when I was growing up. There were 5 of us, and we had 1 bathroom. And I do remember, there would be fights over the bathroom, and so that was part of the childhood growing up. But like you, I mean, we didn't know what we didn't have, and I think it's important to realize that, at least for my generation, when I was growing up, because my parents, of course, came of age during the Depression, so the way we were living was a tremendous step up, probably the same kind of level step up that our children are experiencing. This does play into one of my personal pet peeves, and that is there's this trope that goes around that says, well, back in the 50s, you could own a house and a car and on one income and what have you. And well, that's true today if you're willing to drive that car and if you're willing to live in that house. But now when people say, oh, I can't afford a house, they're not thinking about that 800 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. They're thinking about a 2,500 square foot, 2.5 bedroom, or 2.5 bath, 4-bedroom, house with granite countertops and hardwood floors and all this stuff. And well, yeah, I mean, that is considerably more expensive. But if you're willing to live in that 800 square foot house, you can probably get by on one income. And some people are choosing to do that.
What was your childhood like, Doug?
Pretty similar to what you described. I think we had, 5 people in a 3-bedroom. I think we had a 1.5 bath. So there weren't as many lines as there were at y'all's houses. But one interesting thing, like Carl, you said you each have a toilet at your house now, and you even have some bidets. You've really upgraded your lifestyle. And I don't know, just how do you think that'll impact your kids growing up with such a fancy toilet? Does everybody have one, or
the bidet, or no,
the bidet? Yeah,
I have one, and the one other member of my household, my older daughter, wants one in her toilet, and the other 2 female members of my household hate the bidet with a passion. They both have tried it. They both have taken it for a test drive, a test spray, and they hate it. But yeah, the funny thing is, so I'll make 2 points, Doug. Like, despite us having 4 toilets, our children still find ways to fight over one of them. I'm like, dude, there's like 3 other ones. Just go out. Like, when I was a kid, sometimes I went out in the backyard just because I didn't want to wait, and that's what you had to do. But I kind of enjoy that too. So that's and it's
get outdoors. Yeah.
Yeah, it's different for guys. We're more equipped to do that.
Right. And I was going to say, JL, to the point of the 50s being sort of like the golden age, I was reading one of the Morgan Housel books recently, and that is cited like the 50s and 60s as one of those golden periods. He mentions that after the war, sort of the economic discrepancy between classes was sort of compressed. So like your neighbors you weren't trying to keep up with the Joneses. And if you were, they were just a little bit ahead of you. So it made everyone feel a little bit more content. Do you have any thoughts about that specifically? And maybe you read the book as well, or whatever passage I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I'm not sure what passage you're thinking of. I'm in the middle of his second book at the moment. You know, I think there is something to be said for that, because, you know, focusing on toilets for a second, if we went back 100 years ago, the conversation would be, you know, man, we are so lucky we have an indoor toilet. You know, when our parents' generation, they didn't have indoor plumbing. You know, they had an outhouse. I mean, so that's one of the things I was saying earlier is because of this human drive that we have to make things better. You know, every generation has a higher standard of living that then becomes commonplace, right? So I think one of the keys to dissatisfaction, and it is kind of remarkable given how wonderful everything is in this day and age, how much dissatisfaction there is. And I think it probably comes down to envy. I mean, Charlie Munger, I think, said something along the lines of, you know, that was the biggest problem is envy of what somebody else has. And in our modern age, with our modern technology and being online all the time, what other people have is always in our face. And I think that's what makes people unhappy. It's not some arbitrary level of income or lifestyle. It's more, does that guy have more than I have? And there have been a lot of research, psychological research done on this subject that, you know, if you are making $50,000 a year and the people around you are making 40, you feel pretty good about that. If the people around you are making 60, you don't feel so good about it. And it's the same $50,000, right? Buys the same level of stuff. So yeah, I think that's sort of the root of our discontent is that envy. And to the degree that you can let go of that envy I think has a lot to do with how content you're going to be with your life no matter where you are. I mean, if you're Jeff Bezos and you're focused on the fact that Elon Musk has a greater net worth than you do, well, you know, I guess unless you're Elon Musk, there's always going to be somebody who has a greater net worth, and at some point somebody will eclipse him. So, you know, it can be never ending if you don't control your own emotions around it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, JL. You hinted at this. We live in the best times ever. There are diseases that killed people 2 decades ago that are curable now. It's amazing, all the advancement, and it's amazing how good our lives are. Yet we look at these times like the 50s and think that they're better, and they're not. But back to your point on envy, and then we'll wrap this part of it up. how do you get over stuff like that? Like you alluded to, there's always going to be someone with more than you. And that's part of it, acknowledging that and realize that you can't win the race, therefore you shouldn't play it. But do either of you have any other tips for getting to whatever your level of enough is and being happy at that point and just stopping and being content?
I think if you decide ahead of time, that is quite helpful. But one thing has happened around here recently. So I usually have that kind of stuff under control. But 3 of my friends in the last year have gotten Tesla Model Ys. So now I'm thinking, that's not a bad thing. But it's like my personal friends that I could like text and I see them all the time. Yeah, you're one of them, Carl. And the thing is, I had much lower interest in the past, but now all my friends are getting it. So now it's like within my circle and within my tribe, and it's right in my face. So now I'm like, oh, well, when I do need a new car, which I don't, maybe I should look at those. Like all my friends have already vetted the process. So it is tough, but just overall, like I realize that getting more stuff like usually doesn't make me happier or more content, and it's usually something else. So it doesn't mean I don't get pulled to the dark side. I do, but most of the time I've decided ahead of time like what I'm aiming for, and I try to stay like within that.
In jail, we'll go to you in a second, but Doug, I have to say that I thought about the Tesla and I'm envious of you because you have a lifestyle that you can walk to most of the things you need. And sometimes I do walk to your house. It's like 3 miles each way, but the gym is right behind you. And that's probably where I drive to the most. So I'm envious that you don't have to buy a stupid Tesla, that you have more of a walking lifestyle.
Thanks.
Anyway, Jail, what do you think?
Well, I think there you go. It's no matter what you have or what your situation is, somebody is envious of you, right? So the two of you are envious of each other. I think Doug touched on it. It takes a conscious effort, because I think there's a certain part of our human psychology that's hardwired to look around at what everybody else has and be envious of it. And if you don't want to fall into that trap, I think it takes a conscious effort to be aware of it, and then to decide that no, I'm not gonna let that happen. I remember when I was a kid, my mother saying to me, "Never tell anybody how much you have, because there are only 2 possible reactions. If they have more than you, they don't care. If they have less than you, they're going to envy you, and neither one of those is good." And I think there's a lot of truth to that. For my own part, I made a conscious decision that when I met people who were more successful than I am, who have greater wealth than I do, who achieve some significant milestone in their life, people that I'm friends with, I want to celebrate with them. I don't want to be that person who resents the fact that they achieved something I didn't, or have something that I don't. It's like, hey, I want to be the one that they can feel comfortable sharing that with, and who they know will genuinely be happy for them and celebrating it along with them. And that's made a big difference in my life. I think it's made a difference to my friends who are on the receiving end of it, but it's also made a difference to me. And so it doesn't bother me that other people have more than I do. And I've met a lot of people in this community and in my business career who had significantly more than I do. And it doesn't diminish what I have or what I have achieved, and I've had plenty. If Jeff Bezos was walking down the street and he saw my entire net worth sitting on the sidewalk, it would be a poor use of his time to bend over and pick it up, right? It just wouldn't be worth his time. But the fact that, he's worth a couple of $100 billion just doesn't diminish me at all. And in fact, the thing that he created has greatly enhanced my life. I mean, The Simple Path to Wealth never would have been published if it hadn't been for Jeff Bezos. Because if it hadn't been for Amazon, that book never would have seen the light of day. And all the people who tell me about how that book has profoundly changed their life for the better, they would not have enjoyed that benefit if I hadn't written it, and I never would have written it because I knew no publisher would ever touch it. If I didn't have a platform to self-publish it on, that Jeff Bezos created. So I'm not going to resent Jeff Bezos for what he has. It's not going to help me. And, I've benefited enormously from what he created. So more power to him.
Yeah, I think some of it's an issue with society. You always see these lists online, like the top 10 wealthiest people or the top 10 billionaires under 30. Have you seen those, Doug?
Occasionally, yeah.
And I think it's kind of silly. You never see an article like the top 10 people who gave money away or anything like that. It's always net worth, and it becomes just like a job, part of people's identity, I think, and causes envy in other people to worship these people. Unfortunately, I wish we would get past that and be more open about money and not, but just from a logical point so we could help other people and not worship them or silly behavior like that.
And Carl, do you want to answer the question that you asked us about how you, I don't remember the original question, how do you keep your desires in check?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I am, like I said, I'm envious of you, Doug, and I'm also envious of you, JL, but not for money. It's because you're not freezing your ass off in Florida like we are here. I almost froze to death this morning to do this interview with you, JL. That's how much I care about you in this interview. No, I just made that up.
A small price to pay, Carl.
Yeah, how to keep envy down. I've thought a lot about what makes me happy, and it's just going for a walk and erring on the side of simplicity. Like, Doug, I am really serious. Like, it's pretty cool that you don't need a car most of the time, and that's what makes me happy. And knowing that money isn't really going to, money and things, like I try to think all the time, what could I buy or what experiences could I have to make me happy? And occasionally I think of one, but it's pretty difficult. I just like a simple life, and knowing that is, I think, keeps the envy down.
Nice. Here's a quick word from our sponsor, GhostBed. Amazing mattress, unreal sleep. And Carl, we're thinking about going to the economy conference, and we'll be sleeping away from our normal palace of a bed. Not that we share a bed, but we'll be at an away field. We don't have the home court advantage, and we have to figure out how to sleep well. And cool thing, side note, our friend Rich, who hooked us up at GhostBed to sponsor these shows, he's actually going to be at Economy. So he's a listener of the show. So we're all going to be able to hang out and stuff. But travel tips, how do you sleep well at a conference in a hotel?
I usually don't, but one thing I've thought about doing is bringing some of my own stuff with me, like a pillow. And Mindy and our girls actually do this. And I always thought it was kind of silly, like more crap to bring with, but sleep is so important that I thought about doing that. And one thing I do is I sleep with a body pillow at home. Do you sleep with that, Doug? Or?
Yeah, it's more of like a doll kind of situation. But yeah, it's something you could cuddle with.
So we were at Economy. I don't know if you remember this conversation, but I was lamenting my lack of a body pillow. And you're like, well, I could be the body pillow for you for this weekend. And I thank you, Doug, for that offer, but I turned that down. And I'm looking at the GhostBed site. I don't think they have one, but if they did, it'd be pretty crazy, but I might find a way to bring that sucker with me, because what I usually end up doing is you call the front desk and ask for a bunch of pillows, but it's not quite the same.
Right. I started traveling with a pillow, like if we're going for like more than a week or so and then we're driving, I started to bring a pillow. It made a huge difference for the sleep. But travel-wise, basically the best I could do is just like make the room extremely cold and turn the AC on or whatever I have to do to make it like under 60 degrees. And that usually helps out more than anything else. The other thing is like not drinking nearly as much as I used to in the past. So fingers crossed that Economy, be able to get to bed a little bit earlier. How do you deal with that, by the way?
The situation has been on my mind because I think my chili pad actually died a couple days ago. I woke up and you could see the current temperature, and I set it like to 58, and I wake up and it's at 80. And usually there's a little bit of a difference, but not that much. But the interesting thing is I haven't been waking up hot, and I also haven't been drinking. So I wonder, I think that's probably why, which is great.
Yeah. But we love to drink, and it's kind of a staple at Economy. So we'll figure it out when we get there.
We'll talk to Rich. Maybe he has some ghost bed suggestions, or I'll probably bring my ghost bed pillow with me.
So check out Ghost Bed. It is a family-owned business. They're sleep experts with 20 years plus of experience. There's 60,000 5-star reviews, and they have a 101 night at home sleep trial. You could head over to ghostbed.com/milehighfi, and there's a coupon code milehighfi. You can get 50% off. We really appreciate it, and hang out with Rich and us at Economy. And maybe you could tell us more about Ghost Beds.
Yeah. Is Rich going to be coming to our opening party, which we can briefly mention? Do you have any idea?
He better.
Yeah, he better. He better bring some ghost swag too.
Yeah. Tell us about the quick opening event.
Yes. So Thursday night at Economy, I think that's the 13th. I'm not quite sure of the date, but it is the actual day before the event starts. This is we call it the official, unofficial party because Economy is not sponsoring it. Doug and I are, along with Ellen Donegan and Mindy, my wife from Bigger Pockets. So it's going to be at 6 p.m. at Esoteric Brewing, which is pretty close. I think it's less than a mile and a half from the Fairfield, one of the main hotels. And the first 50 people will get a free drink coupon.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks a lot to Ghost Bed. We'll link up in the description, and let's get back to the conversation with JL.
Okay, let's move on. One more question, and then we'll talk about your books, JL. So this is a two-parter. I'll ask you the first part. So I think FIRE has evolved from a mindset of frugality, like early retirement extreme, maybe a little bit with Pete, although I don't think any of us would say he lives a life of deprivation, but he did say he lives on $24,000 a year. His original post said that. But now I feel like we've evolved to more of intentional living and even spending. Do you agree with that? Do you think FIRE has evolved like that?
I don't actually. I mean, I think it's my experience with the FIRE community or the FI community, which goes back to 2011 when I first started my blog. And of course, when I first started my blog, and the blogs that were out there, like Early Retirement Extreme and Mr. Money Mustache, who started, I think, a couple months before I did, they were focused on the more frugal end of the spectrum. But as I started to meet people in the community, and mostly at Chautauqua, so I did the first Chautauqua in 2013, I was a little stunned at the diversity of people who came. And again, diversity on all measures. I mean, racial and ethnic diversity, certainly, but age diversity, occupational diversity, levels of wealth diversity, gender and sexual orientation, any measure of human diversity you could think of was represented in this small group of 25 people that we'd gathered together. It was kind of incredible. And I had never thought about that I was just hoping somebody would show up, right? And so that was an eye-opening thing for me. So my experience of the FI movement was not this trope that it's only for hyper-frugal people, or the other side of it, it's only for high-tech engineers, highly paid six-figure people, because and then every Chautauqua after that, the groups were equally diverse, so it wasn't a fluke. So I think, hyper-frugality has always been a part of it. I think that what's come to be known as fat FIRE was always a part of it. But, think what's happened is the things beyond the hyper-frugal model that were already there, suddenly people started writing about their experiences in them. So I don't see it as moving away from the frugality. I think it's just acknowledging what was already there. It's a pretty diverse community in terms of how people approach it.
Interesting. I wonder if some of that perspective is maybe people who went to Chautauqua were perhaps further along on the path. And when I came into it, I was early on the path. Would you say that's true? Or did you see people from all levels of, I guess, net worth come to Chautauqua as well?
Yeah, I did see, we had people, from one extreme. There was a guy, I can't remember who it was or even what Chautauqua, but I remember having a one-on-one session with a guy who was still in debt who had come. And I remember that distinctly because I said to him, this is not how you should be spending your money. And we were about halfway through the week and he corrected me and he said, oh no, he said, this is just extraordinarily beneficial. There have been several people who've come who were just at ground zero, just at the very beginning of their journey. And by the same token, there have been people who've come to it that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's been a huge range. And that's interesting to me because Chautauqua was not cheap. I mean, we did it was a first class experience. It lasted for a week. We went to really cool places. I designed it selfishly that way because that's how I wanted to spend the week. And so you would think that it would only be people further along in their journey. And maybe I've never really run the numbers, but I imagine proportionally that was probably true, but it was certainly not entirely true. The full range, again, that's part of the diversity that always amazed me is the full range of economic diversity was there.
One observation, Carl, is a lot of the early bloggers were like tech bros and they got the most attention up front and maybe they were a little more frugal. And now more people it's easier to start a blog. It's easier to spread your message and story and like share your story with people that are similar to you. And it's taken 15 years for everything to catch up, or maybe just 10. And now things are a lot more diverse just in general. But what do you think of that? Because like you were kind of on the front end of it as well, even though you came in like 3, 4, 5 years later than some of the original financial bloggers.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation because I'm seeing things about myself. And you're right, Doug. A tech bro is going to be, I'm not like a tech bro has some connotations and I'm not going to label myself as that, but I was in the tech industry. So it's going to be much easier for me to stand up a blog and write about this versus someone who may have made their money some other way in a non-technical way that isn't going to be as familiar with computers and websites and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I lived with my own tunnel vision and I think we gravitate towards people who look like us. It's just human nature. So I see Mr. Money Mustache and early retirement extreme engineer type guys are similar to my age. And that's unfortunately who you tend to pay more attention to. So that probably influenced me as well.
I have a huge contingent of like a bald audience, which is interesting. I never thought that, but you're 100% right.
I think I saw the Facebook group with your people. Yeah, there's like 100. It's amazing.
It's a lifestyle, I would say.
Yeah, you better not be outside on a sunny day. The sun might bounce off your heads and everyone would be blinded. Bring your sunblock if you ever have an event. But
yeah, for real. JL, what's your secret to your thick head of luscious hair there?
Well, I don't cut it off. So I mean, that's genetics, and I am, now I'm in my 70s and I guess I'm not going to go bald. I was talking to somebody, a friend of mine who was saying, I was watching one of your interviews and during this particular interview, your head was shaved. I said, man, that goes back a few years. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago, but every now and again, I would just cut all my hair off just for a change of pace. I've never been one of these people who's felt that I've always had to keep my hair at the same length. I tend to let it grow and let it grow and let it grow and let it grow. And because I guess I don't want to bother getting haircuts, and then I have it cut short. And every now and again, I just cut it all off. And I like the way it feels when it's cut all off. But it doesn't look very good. I mean, if I was as good looking as you, Doug, I'd probably go around with a shaved head too. But I look like this, so I got to have hair to offset it.
Thanks. That's kind of you to say that. All right. What's next, Carl?
Before I wrap this part up, Doug, I wanted to say that I'm kind of sad because you never got the chance to go to a Chautauqua. I went to 3 of them, and they're probably some of the best 3 weeks of my life. Like Dan and Cindy, you know them. Like I met them at Chautauqua, and Jason and Shayna, who I don't think you have met yet, but all these great friends I have and keep in touch with. But Doug, maybe we should relaunch it. We could have like Camp Carl or Doug Fest or something like that. We'd probably get like 4 people to show up, and half of those would be us.
Yeah.
But maybe keep it in the back of your mind, Doug.
Okay. I think we could work something out. Yeah.
Yeah,
JL,
it really, in addition to the here we are doing ads for Chautauqua, which doesn't exist anymore. So, I last year was or the year before now was the last Chautauqua. But anyway, it did bring, in addition to the diversity of people, just incredibly cool people. And I'm still friends with a lot of the people you mentioned. I'm friends with those guys as well. A lot of Chautauquans. I mean, Chautauquans themselves would say the coolest thing about it is I got to hang out with all these people who kind of get it, and friendships formed, businesses formed, relationships. There are people who met their significant others there. I'm aware of at least one child that was conceived. So yeah, Chautauqua was quite the event.
Just to be clear, was the child conceived at Chautauqua?
Yes.
All right. I wasn't expecting.
So I'm told.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that answer, but here we go. Yeah, it was a great experience, even better than I thought, apparently.
Yeah. Well, better for some people than you.
Yeah.
As good as it was for you.
We could cover that in a Too Hot for Mile High Fi. It's on our OnlyFans page. We'll talk to you about it later, JL. I think we can get you on board too.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's talk about books. JL, you are a prolific writer, and you just came out with a new book called Pathfinders, which is great. I just got done reading it on my cruise. Can you give a brief overview for the audience about what Pathfinders is about?
Yeah, so when Simple Path to Wealth came out in 2016, probably within 6 months, I started getting feedback from people of all different kinds of background, telling me how much the book had meant to them and how they had taken the lessons from it and implemented it into their own lives and unique situations. And some of these messages came from all over the world. And that was striking to me because I wrote that book for one person. And that was my daughter, who was in college at the time, who's obviously an American. And so it's a book that is kind of U.S. centric and focused on somebody at the beginning of their journey. Well, I'd hear from people in other countries that were in the middle of their journeys and had to change things. So I was just endlessly fascinated by these stories that I would hear, and I wanted to for years I've wanted to bring a book like this together. So Pathfinders, when we started it, and when I say we, I mean Chris, my editor at Harriman House. Pathfinders, by the way, is the only book that I've done through a publisher, and that was a great experience, and largely because of Chris. And so when we sat down and we were thinking about how to do this, I put out a call to my readership, on my blog and Twitter and what have you, asking people to send in their stories. And we didn't really know if we'd get enough stories for a book, right? This was kind of an idea, but we got more than enough stories. And then the second question was, well, are they going to be any good? Are they going to be usable? And when I put out the call for the stories, I said, don't worry about whether you're a writer. Don't think to yourself, I'm not going to do this because, we have editors. We can handle that part of it. Just tell us your story. Well, we got a great response. And so Pathfinders is a collection of 100 of these stories. Some of them are only a few paragraphs long. Some of them are a few pages. As we went through them, they kind of self-organized into what are the 9 sections now, everything from debt to endgame, which is what it looks like when you finally achieved FI, to lifestyle inflation and saving and investing. And so they kind of self-organized into 9 categories. And then I write an introduction to each of those categories, talking about, because I have to express my opinion about all this stuff. So, what my thoughts are on that. And then we present the stories. And one of the most gratifying things is that the people who contributed stories and then see it in the book have gotten back and said, wow, I love the way you edited my story. You made it better without changing my voice. And that means a lot to us, because that was one of our big goals, is to make it as readable for the reader as possible, but to absolutely keep the voice of the person telling the story. And I think we accomplished that.
And you said there's 9 different sections and about 100 different stories. Who is the right reader for this book?
Great question, Doug. And early on, along those same lines, one of the questions I was asked was, do you have to have read The Simple Path to Wealth first? And my answer to that was and still is no, not at all. I mean, Pathfinder stands on its own. But then as I reflected on it, not only do you not have to read The Simple Path to Wealth first, but if you are new to this FI concept, if you're new to the idea of pursuing financial independence, Pathfinders is probably the better introductory book than The Simple Path to Wealth. A lot of people over the years have told me that, in fact, I think you guys, that they buy multiple copies of The Simple Path to Wealth to give away to people, to introduce them to the whole idea. And that's wonderful. But I think in some ways Pathfinders is the better introductory drug, if you will, because the big question people have when they first hear about FI, I think, is, well, gee, that sounds great, but is it really doable? Is it something that somebody like me could really make happen? And if you read Pathfinders, you'll read incredible stories. And you can't read Pathfinders and then ever look in the mirror again and say it can't be done or that I can't do it, because you'll read stories no matter what your circumstance is. I can almost promise you, you will read stories from people starting from more humble beginnings who have done it. And so I think that's got to be incredibly inspirational to somebody who's thinking about, this sounds great. When I hear these podcasts and, I read these books, it sounds great, but can ordinary real people do this? Well, Pathfinders, I think, answers that question. So that's a long answer to your question, Doug. That's who it's for. And then by the same token, if you're already on the path, like Carl is obviously, and you said you enjoyed it. I am. I love reading these stories. Then I think there's something very satisfying about knowing how you've done it, what your path looked like, and then reading about the challenges that other people have faced and how they've done it.
Yeah, one of the stories in the book, I can't make this up, is I think he was a migrant asparagus farmer
right.
As a child, right? Is that correct, JL?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the stories I was thinking of when I said, people from more humble beginnings. Yeah, he was a child migrant laborer picking asparagus in the field. And, talk about a challenging start to your economic life. And, he's well on his way. We were talking about toilets earlier in the conversation. There's a story with somebody saying, when I was growing up, the rich people were the ones who had a toilet. So, there's some incredible stories in there. There's a story in there from a guy who is not only pursuing FI in Ukraine, but he has a podcast in Ukrainian for other Ukrainians pursuing FI, and their country is in the process of fighting off an invader. So, I think that's inspirational, and it also, when I meet people say, that FI sounds great, but I'd have to give up my least luxury cars. Well, okay. Yeah. I'm hearing from people who are worried about being bombed, and they're still figuring out a way to do it. So.
Wow.
I didn't think the asparagus story was real. Carl told me about this. It's in our notes, but I wasn't sure how that fit in, but that's quite a turn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, and like I say, that's not, people it's just amazing what people can accomplish if they decide they want to accomplish. It was Henry Ford who supposedly said, if you think you can do it or you think you can't do it, you're right.
Yes. I love that quote. So good.
And I think that's so true.
Yeah. Doug and I are actually working on a book now, and I have found that writing a book is much harder than writing a blog post. And I know you've done both as well, JL. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you mentioned that I was prolific. I don't know if that's the right word, but it at least for me, when I write a book, it takes me years to recover from the trauma to write it, to try to write another one. Gloria Steinem was once asked if she liked writing. She was genuinely prolific. And her response to that question was, I think, perfect. She said, I like having written. And that's how I feel about it. I love the fact that I've got 3 books published. Writing the things was just sheer drudgery. And the other thing I'll say is, I put the Simple Path to Wealth together because at that point I'd been writing the blog for a number of years, and I'd kind of already written the material, and I thought to myself, I just have to massage this material into a book. It should be pretty easy. Well, turns out in retrospect, it's easier to start from scratch than to try to massage. And you're into real estate, Carl. I think you can appreciate this. It is easier, I think most people would say, to build a house from scratch than it is to take a ramshackle house and refurbish it. And I think that's kind of the analogy.
Yeah.
Although thinking about that, I've just said my blog posts are ramshackle, so maybe that's not such a great thing.
I do completely agree with that. It would have been easier to start from nothing than to try to reconcile your previous work with a new body of work.
Well, one of the things, so I have the stock series on the blog, and a lot of that content is in the Simple Path to Wealth. And one of the challenges that it never occurred to me when I started, but only when I was in the middle of it, is when you write a blog post, or at least when I write a blog post, if I use any kind of terminology or jargon, I explain it in the blog post. Because I have to assume that, I can't assume that anybody reading that post has read the stuff that came before. In a book, you can assume that if people are in chapter 5, they've read 1 to 4. But you can't do that, I don't think, with blog posts. So every time you bring up the 4% rule as an example, you kind of have to say a couple of words in a blog post about what that thing is. But when you're trying to massage a bunch of blog posts into a book, and you've done that, well, now you have to figure out, okay, where exactly have I mentioned the 4% rule as an example? And so I've got to take that out of all those chapters. And then I also have to decide at what point in the book do I introduce this concept? Right? So it's just becomes a very complicated and cumbersome process that you don't have if you start from scratch.
And you did an audiobook too. You read it yourself?
Well, so on the Simple Path to Wealth, I read it myself. Pathfinders, there's an audiobook too, which is professionally narrated. And it's narrated by both male and female narrators because our stories come from both male and female storytellers.
Got it. And for Simple Path, just curious of the process of recording the audiobook. Was it pretty tedious? Did you do a great job and it wasn't a big deal? How'd that go?
So it was very tedious. I did a terrible job. So recording the audiobook for Simple Path to Wealth, Audible wanted me to record it. And I think because they felt that listeners prefer listening to books in the voice of the author. And I'd never done anything like that before, so I thought, well, that's cool. I'm willing to do that. And they found I was living in New Hampshire at the time, and they found a studio out in the New Hampshire countryside. And so I went there for, I want to say 5 consecutive days for like 6 hours each day, sitting in front of a microphone, talking with throat coat tea and throat lozenges. And it's a tough thing to do. And because I'm not a professional, what I recorded was a bit of a hot mess, and I frequently record the same line multiple times. And now many people who've listened to The Simple Path to Wealth tell me I have not, by the way, but they tell me it sounds wonderful. It's great. And so you did a wonderful job. And I say, and I'm not being falsely humble when I say this, if that's true, and I've heard it enough that I believe it, all the credit goes to the editors who took that hot mess that I'd given them and massaged it into something that evidently sounds like I just sat down and it flowed out seamlessly.
I've listened to it. It sounds pretty good. So, I mean, you have to take some credit, but yeah, maybe the editors did a great job.
Yeah, the editors did a great job.
Cool. JL and Doug, I have one last question, but it's a different topic. Do either of you have anything else before we end this episode? Okay.
That's good.
So, Doug, last time I talked to JL, we had a little bit of a debate over pizza styles. And I don't know if I've ever asked you this before, but what is your favorite style of pizza? Because JL and I have a very different opinion.
It shifts from time to time. I was going to say I do enjoy like a deep dish style currently. And there's a place in town here that does like a Detroit style. So that's like sort of fresher on my mind. But I also like an Italian, like thin crust and like a brick oven that's really hot. So completely different styles. I love all pizzas. So I'm quite open. And I even like a Pizza Hut, you know, like I'm that kind of a person where I'm like, yeah, Pizza Hut, that's great. I grew up on that stuff, right?
So you're like a pizza polygamist, pizzaist?
Yeah. Low standards, whatever. Just give it to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll
What
take
about
it.
you? What do you got?
Yeah. So JL likes the thin crust and I like the deep dish, but are you talking about Urban Field for the Detroit style?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll have to come out there and try some of that deep dish, although it's heresy.
JL's from Chicago, the birthplace of deep dish, I think.
You know, not only am I from Chicago, the birthplace of deep dish, but I ate in the restaurant back in the day when it was a brand new thing.
Wow, which restaurant was that?
I think it was Uno's was the name of it.
Yeah, Pizzeria.
But I
Uno.
remember that restaurant opening because deep dish, as far as I know, was an entirely new concept. And of course, everybody was super excited about it. And it was, you know, I mean, I do, for all the teasing and for the rash I've given you about this, Carl, I do enjoy deep dish pizza as well. It's just that when I think of pizza now, because I've had deep dish pizza, you know, thin crust is where it's at. Yeah. But I remember enjoying it back in the day. And I remember, you know, long lines out of that restaurant, you know, from people wanting to get in. So,
are you a sausage or pepperoni person, JL?
Pepperoni.
Okay.
Aren't you going to ask me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've learned you'll eat anything. So
yeah. Both.
Yeah.
Both, either or. I'll take it all.
Pineapple?
Yeah. Give it to me. Back to asparagus. I make some pizzas at home occasionally, but I'll hide asparagus like under the cheese, and the unsuspecting victims like figure it out later when they go pee, and they're like, "Did you put asparagus in this?"
Nice.
Yeah, sneak vegetables in there.
Wow. Cool. I think that's all. Thank you so much, JL, for being on.
All right. Yeah, JL, where should people find the book? Where do you want them to go?
Well, so the easiest thing to do is go to the blog, which is jlcollinsnh.com. And once you're there, you know, you'll see covers of the book that you can click on, and they'll take you to Amazon. So if you're looking for Pathfinders, one of the nice things about doing a book through a publisher is that they push it out to bookstores and evidently airports. And so I've had people say to me that, you know, they've seen it in the wild, so to speak. So you can get that one in bookstores. Simple Path to Wealth, you're probably never going to see in a bookstore. If you go to a bookstore and ask for it, they'll order it for you, but you're not going to see it on the shelf because I self-published it. But you can get all three from Amazon easily enough.
Great. We'll link it up. And thanks a lot. Good catching up.
Cool. Thank you.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for listening to the show. That was the Mile High 5 podcast, and I'm Doug Cunnington, the balder host, and Carl Jensen is the cool, sexy one. If you dig the show, please do 3 things for us. Number 1, tell a friend, a family member, an enemy about the show. We really don't care who you tell. Maybe forward them a specific show that you know that they will like. It's the single most helpful thing that you can do to spread the word. It's like giving us a virtual high five, and actually we don't give high fives in person, so the virtual kind's pretty good. And more importantly, your friend or family member or even your enemy will appreciate the fact that you were thinking of them. Number 2, make sure you're following or subscribed on your podcast app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, whatever you're using, and that way you won't miss a show. And number 3, please leave us a rating and review. We read them on the show occasionally, and you might hear yours out there on an upcoming episode. Quick disclaimer, this show is not financial or legal advice. I'd actually be surprised if it sounded like it. It's really just for entertainment, and that's at least what we're hoping for. But seriously, get advice from professionals. Carl and I are just 2 guys with microphones that sit in my basement and talk. So we'll catch y'all next week.
Well, recently, I mean, it's been very wet. We got down here on December 2nd, and we were in Florida last winter as well, in St. Augustine for December. And I remember it being much nicer, much sunnier, and even a little warmer. But yeah, it's just been a really wet few weeks and into January, lots and lots of rain. So we went out, Jane and I went out for our walk this morning. I said, we better get out and take our walk now because, in a few hours, it's not going to be, you're not going to be able to do it without getting a bath at the same time. So,
yeah, that's cool. I don't know. What part of Florida is that in?
So we're in Sebastian.
Okay.
And if we're on the Atlantic coast, if you look at a map of Florida, we're about midway coast going north and south. So,
gotcha.
Yeah,
all right.
It's nice.
And then Carl, make sure you talk a little bit. What'd you do when you went to the gym this morning?
I walked laps around the track, and it was quite miserable because there's no exertion involved in that. But I don't know if you've been to the gym when it's super cold. It's -10 here this morning. There's something wrong with the heat. I actually talked to the front desk about this. And if you go up to where the track is, it's probably like 85 in that area. So the heat overcompensates somehow. Like they have some issue. So you're barely moving around the track, sweating like crazy. It's horrible.
It's like a little sauna in there.
Wait a second. Don't you go to the gym to sweat?
Kind of, I guess. I don't know. I don't like heat, though. I'd rather err on the side of it being cold and sweat naturally because of my exertion versus the air temperature.
Yeah, you need that Goldilocks.
You get to sweat without any effort.
I guess so.
Like being in a sauna.
All right.